5, 6, 7, 8.
Hi EXers, welcome to the EX Podcast episode number 38. This is your host, Stefan Vincent. I've started this podcast last year because I believe that companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talent. The podcast brings a different lens to the employee experience, a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a conventional HR perspective. Our guests, all thought leaders and disruptors in the EX space in their own way, come to this show to debate, discuss, and share best practices on the key components that foster employee engagement and strengthen company culture, and also to spark the conversation on how to create positive employee experiences. One size doesn't fit all. What Airbnb or Google do around the employee experience may simply not be applicable in a smaller company. And this is what this show is all about. Sharing stories of companies of all sizes, not only to show that EX doesn't require a large budget or a large team, but also that there isn't one recipe. Each company can find its own way through the EX journey. Today's guest is John Hardy. John is calling from Minneapolis. He is the Diversity and Inclusion Manager at Best Buy. Today with John, we will talk about what D&I means at Best Buy and how it fits in the corporate strategy, what diversity is versus inclusion, how Best Buy measures the impact of D&I on its business, how they get managers and employees to buy in their D&I initiatives, what challenges they faced along the way, and what advice John has to share around D&I. This episode is brought to you by Fusion Alliance. Fusion Alliance delivers holistic solutions fusing together data, digital, and technology to redefine customer experiences and move your ideas to execution. That's why businesses across multiple industries have relied on Fusion's expertise and partnership for over 25 years. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with John. If you get a chance, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube. And last thing, if you want to send me feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at @ex_summit. All right, let's get right to it. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the EX Podcast. Super excited for today's guest, John Hardy. John is calling from Minneapolis and he's the Diversity and Inclusion Manager at Best Buy. John, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
To kick it off, tell us a bit more about your background and what you do at Best Buy.
Yeah, sure. So I'm born and raised in Minneapolis, a lifelong Best Buy fan, obviously being in our hometown here. It's a very important business for the city. So I got to have the privilege of coming to Best Buy about 7 years ago. Right out of college, actually, and I joined our business teams in the demand planning space, which essentially does inventory buying and working with vendors to make sure that all the stores are supplied with the appropriate levels of inventory and managing the budgets. But I found that while that work was very rewarding in some ways, it was very transactional. And I'm really a person who loves to work with people, and I really wanted to be doing something more transformative in nature. Probably on my second week of joining Best Buy, I joined the Black Employee Network at the company here. I really got exposed to how amazing the work of diversity and inclusion is within an organization and how important it is for the community and for the growth and development of some of the underrepresented folks who might be in the building. So, the way I define that work is going deep, going wide, and moving up, meaning that it's really a space to create authentic relationships and find some really close friends and colleagues in the workspace. It's also probably the best place to meet people across the entire enterprise because you have somebody from every walk of life represented in your groups. And also, there's not a better place to get exposure to senior leaders, even at your earliest days within your organization. So I was always intrigued by the work of culture and diversity and inclusion. Since probably high school, I've been engaged with a ton of different programs, whether in the creative spaces with music, with arts, within professional organizations, in college. So it's kind of a natural transition for me to move more professionally into the work of diversity and inclusion. I've been on the team for about 4 years now.
How many employees are Best Buy?
Give or take 1,000 or two, probably somewhere sitting between 120,000 and 130,000 at any given time. It's quite a few.
And that's a good size. What does D&I mean at Best Buy, and how does it fit into the corporate strategy?
Yeah. So D&I has been a journey that Best Buy has been on for quite a few years. We've done a lot of different initiatives, both at corporate and in the field. But what I'm really pleased to say that over the last probably 3 or 4 years, we made some substantial progress. When I joined the team about 4 years ago, the topic of diversity and inclusion was actually sitting next to alcoholism and sexual harassment in the workplace, which was pretty much considered a compliance-oriented line of focus. To couple with that, we had quite a few people throughout the organization who were people champions leading the work, but it wasn't necessarily tied to the organizational or leadership strategy, and it lacked some accountability. So anytime that you had a great leader who was doing the work, and they might have been promoted because of the great work they do, not only for the business, but for the culture, you lose some of that knowledge and focus, and you kind of go back to square one. So it's really been a huge focus for Best Buy over the past few years to make this stuff foundational to our excellence and to our culture. So I'm happy to say that we got the opportunity to move it from the back of the house, if you will, to the front of the house around the topics of leadership and culture for the organization. So even on day one as an employee, you're going to get some exposure to D&I the right way.
Are you aligned with HR?
So if you think about engagement, our senior leaders, I don't think have ever been more engaged in this work. And that's partly due to our CEO, Hubert Joly, and his commitment. And he's been really focused on getting his teams, his direct reports, to sign on as well. So he's signed some pledges in recent years. We just recently appointed a chief diversity officer. So you can really feel the commitment to the work at the top.
It's interesting to hear that you have a chief diversity and inclusion officer. So are you aligned with HR, or is it a separate function?
Yep. So it's actually shuffled around a little bit over the past few years. We used to live within the community relations space, underneath what you can consider public affairs and sustainability and what have you. But the company has realigned us a couple times, and we made our way into the HR team. And it was actually a really good fit because our current chief diversity officer was also leading some work around employee relations. So if you think about dealing with some of the challenges around culture and our people in the field and at corporate, they resolve a lot of the matters that where we kind of don't live up to our values as individuals within a company. So he was a really good fit, I think, for the work. And since he's been on board over the past several months, we've seen a lot of focus and commitment to the work and to the strategy, not only within the people space in HR, but kind of making its way more towards the commercial strategy and the broader implications of our strategies.
So how would you define diversity versus inclusion?
So there's a couple ways to cut it, but I think if you think about Best Buy's definition, we define it as the range of human differences that includes race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, attributes that kind of make you who you are. We also know that diversity isn't necessarily visible, right? It's also a way that you might think about the world or your world experience. It might have to do with the social class that you might have grown up in. It could have to do with your religious or your ethical value systems. It could be around your political beliefs. It's really about all those different ways that we think and show up in the world. Now, on the flip side of that coin, think about inclusion. It's about encouraging everybody to bring their best and most authentic selves to work. So it's really incumbent upon us to create conditions where employees can really leverage those traits and also experience belonging, some ownership, some empowerment, and play a role in the growth within your organization. But, another way to define it is, and I think this is kind of a funny way to say it, but diversity is being invited to the party, whereas inclusion is being asked to dance, right?
That's pretty cool, too. It's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So how do you categorize diversity at Best Buy? I mean, I'm sure you have to necessarily, put labels or tags on people, but somehow you have to categorize what diversity is to be able to implement some initiatives around it. Right? So you talked about, sexual orientation, gender, ethnicity. So do you have those sort of buckets or categories to identify what diversity means?
Yep. And to an extent, that's kind of a yes and a no. There are some dimensions of diversity that can be very apparent, and it's even information that we can collect from folks on a self-identified basis. There's also information that you have to collect about people, or you kind of need to probe a little bit as a leader to figure out what those dimensions look like. If you think about an iceberg, for instance, you can kind of see the tip of what's out there, and you can kind of consider those some primary diversity traits like gender or age, for instance. But then there's a lot of stuff that's under the waterline that you got to go and explore with that person. And there's a proper way to do it, and there's some improper ways to do it. That's a whole nother conversation. But the idea is that we create a space that doesn't just tolerate people, but we actually appreciate people's differences.
So more and more companies now are not only embracing diversity and inclusion, but also including D&I in their corporate strategy.
Yep.
But one big challenge is to measure the impact on the D&I on the business itself. So how does it happen at Best Buy? Do you have the ability to measure and track what impact D&I has on the business?
That's a pretty complex question in general, because there is a ton of information out there about it. But in order to measure it effectively, you kind of got to align it with the people strategy within your organization. And you got to try to tie it back to some financial outcomes and to some customer outcomes. But if you think about both internal research and external benchmarking work, if you think about experience and lessons learned from the past, and also think about hiring consultants who have some strategic expertise to help us define what matters the most. There's a lot of ways to look at the impact. But if you think about a few for Best Buy, a couple really important priorities, have to do with reflecting our customer base. So whether you're in Miami or you're in Minneapolis, Minnesota, we want our stores and our offices to reflect diversity of our communities at every level. So that means from our part-time staff and our stores all the way up to the senior leadership, because we know that customers care that when they walk into that store, that an employee might resonate with them on a few different dimensions of diversity.
Yes.
Because it just makes the connection that much easier, right? Mm-hmm. But you can also think about a variety of data points, both from a performance and an employee feedback perspective, that inform how far the needle might be moving on certain goals. So it's not a perfect science, but there is a ton of research on why gender and ethnic diversity make a difference on the bottom line. There's a famous McKinsey report that came out a few years ago that suggests companies that do gender diversity work really well tend to outperform their peers by about 15%. And for companies who do the ethnic diversity thing pretty well, can be as much as 35% improvement compared to their competitors or their market. So there's a lot of compelling information. But if you think about inside an organization, you can look at stuff like engagement, which you can kind of define as discretionary effort. Have you ever seen the movie Office Space?
Oh, yes.
By the way? Yeah, so about...
Love it.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies. It's called Classic. If you think about the minimum flair that she wore at the restaurant and how the manager was encouraging her to maybe put on a little bit more flair, I always kind of thought of that as a funny analogy to say that you want people on your teams to show up and kind of give their best, not just do the bare minimum, right? So engagement is a really important metric to take a look at. And you can measure that over time through employee surveys and through performance. And you can correlate between, those locations that are highly engaged and their returns. So you think about store performance, if you think about year over year store comparisons to see is my store growing in revenue? I can look at customer data and feedback and say, is our NPS saying that our customers are having a better experience in our stores? All that stuff kind of correlates to engagement. So that's a really important metric to look at. You can also think about, as I mentioned a little bit ago, those employee surveys. Like at Best Buy, we do an annual survey on a variety of topics about the employee experience. That can include anything from the state of how inclusive and healthy the environment is and how inclusive the leadership team might be. You can look at the likeliness to stay at a company over the next year as a sign of how much people like showing up to their job every day. You can look at something as simple as whether or not somebody considers that they have a best friend in the workplace, right? Because all those things make a difference on how engaged and how happy somebody might be. And when somebody's happy, we know that they're going to go above and beyond. But in order to be happy, it's not just about a great environment, but it's about being able to show up authentically as your best self. So that's a couple ways to look at measuring the impact.
No, those are very good illustrations, I would say, especially how it ties to your business in the retail space and customer facing. Now, how do you get all managers and employees to buy in diversity and inclusion initiatives? Yeah,
then there's a couple ways to look at that question. One I would say is that this cannot be a leadership pet project. It has to be tied to the CEO and their direct reports. So, we've tried a number of initiatives that have been grassroots over the years. We found that until it becomes a huge priority and leaders are willing to sign on and hold themselves accountable and hold their teams accountable, this work really doesn't get a lot of traction, because obviously at a company that's $40 billion, over 100,000 employees, there are so many different priorities. We're all kind of aligned around the same vision and some of the key objectives, but there has to just be a drum that's constantly beating in the background. It has to be discussed loudly, has to be discussed often for people to actually understand that it's a priority. Obviously, we work for for-profit organizations, so the bottom line is the bottom line.
Yes.
But there are so many dimensions of the bottom line that are impacted by diversity and inclusion work, as I mentioned earlier with that McKinsey report. But there's a ton of other research that'll tell you do this stuff well, and it leads to an incredible outcome for the business. And I just want to make a quick aside. A couple of years ago, I heard our CEO say something that I think has stuck with me ever since. And he's kind of known as a change agent. And if you know anything about our CEO, he is kind of the darling of Wall Street. He has kind of defied expectations in the retail space. Our business has grown considerably in terms of its stock performance, in terms of being relevant to customers again. And he said that his executive teams often ask him when he comes to an organization, well, let's start with the financials and kind of work our way from there. But he has a pretty firm belief that you have to start with the people and then look at the operating model and then look at the financials, because you can't have an excellent financial model until you have an excellent operational model. But you can't have an excellent operational model until you have an excellent people model, because those are the inputs that derive your outputs, right? So it all begins and ends with the people. So the fact that our CEO can acknowledge that and then show his commitment by signing different pledges and getting his executive teams to sign those pledges is a loud voice for this work. And some of that is being unapologetic, right? Because it's not popular among a lot of communities, especially those folks who might feel threatened, from the zero-sum game kind of mindset, where in order for other people to advance or grow, other people have to lose things. But in reality, we're just trying to grow the pie for everybody and create some equity. Another way to get some buy-in is you have to make the business case relevant to your audience. So depending on who you're speaking to, you need to understand their needs and their priorities, because they're going to be a little bit different depending on who you're talking to. There has to be language that speaks to them on multiple levels. So I think one of the ways I've seen success is leveraging the power of storytelling, right? Striking the balance between facts and data, but also persuasive examples that illustrate the gravity of this work, because it really makes a difference in people's lives. It's not just about the money. It's about people's experiences. Some people dread going to work. I think you and I both know plenty of people in our experience that hate going to the office. They wake up on Monday morning and they're super stressed out, and they feel drained when they come home every day, and they fight with their spouse. it just creates an entire dynamic in their life that's unhealthy. So when you can tell the story of somebody who's struggling, when you can showcase what it's like to be a woman in an all-male environment, when you can talk about how we don't accommodate our employees who might have disabilities or who are pregnant, and you can showcase what a day in the life of that person looks like, that's when you're tugging on heartstrings. And this work is really a head, heart, and hands kind of work, meaning people have to understand it conceptually. They have to understand why it's important. There has to be some kind of heart connection around empathy, because you have to have some compassion for people who are different than you, because you might not be walking in their shoes, but you darn sure should try to understand their worldview. And then you should also have some tools, because I think the $1 million point of feedback I've received is, how do we execute on this? I get why this is important, but how do we do it? That shows up in the recruiting space, that shows up in talent management, performance reviews, that shows up in, challenges that you bring to your teams to make competition fun. I mean, it shows up all over the board. And then lastly, I'll make one more comment on this, is you have to make room for everybody in this work. And a lot of people feel like they don't have a place in the work of diversity and inclusion. And I think I can say, namely, white men, because obviously there's already a majority and kind of an over-indexing of leadership and control within organizations, primarily by white men. So when we're talking diversity and inclusion, and we're talking equity work, and we're talking about helping advance people who are underrepresented, sometimes they feel like, we're coming for their seat. And it's really important to make them understand that we need them in the room, because we can't get this work done unless white men are equally engaged as the black woman in the space, right? If you think about how community organizers operate, they do canvassing. They go to neighborhoods, they knock on doors, and they make a personal invitation to that constituent to ask them to get engaged. That's more than just sending somebody an email or sending them something passive like a newsletter. This is making it personal. This is making it very human for people, because this is very human work. It's emotional, it's scary, and you kind of got to help people break the myths of what this work means.
So do you have training programs? Do you run campaigns internally and maybe even externally to explain what D&I means and means actually for Best Buy?
Yeah, I'll tell you about two quick examples. One is, a couple of years ago, we implemented some very foundational diversity and inclusion trainings for employees both at corporate and in the field. And I had the fortune of being involved with the development process, where we worked with some consultants outside of the company who had some expertise around this topic, and also partnering with some of our internal folks to help make sense for our culture. And we have two foundational trainings, one on implicit bias, which essentially talks about the insidious ways in which our blind spots and the way that we were raised and our worldviews can truly impact people different than us, right? Because we just don't understand what we don't understand. We don't know what we don't know. And the fact of the matter is that like tends to like. So you're probably more inclined to support or help promote somebody who's more like you than not like you. It's really a challenge to connect with somebody different than you. It might be around language. It might be around the neighborhood that you grew up in. But we have to help leaders understand and make them consciously aware that those blind spots create huge roadblocks for people who are different than them. That could be from mentorship and sponsoring people into new opportunities. That could be from just where you go to recruit people and all the talent pools that you're missing out on, because you're not going to catch salmon at Bass Lake, right? You have to go to the talent, but you have to be able to connect with them. So you have to understand where your shortcomings are, because when we're born into this world, we got a clean slate, but somewhere along the line for all of us, somebody got a fisheye lens, and somebody got blinders on, and somebody got a purple filter. And eventually, we're all looking at this world and we think we're talking about the same things objectively, but we're all coming from very subjective points of view. Mm-hmm. And the analogy that I like to use in the trainings that we do is that I was in San Francisco a few years ago with a friend. We decided to do one of those outdoor painting events, right? Just kind of one of those cool afternoon fun things to do. And we got to paint the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge, right? And here we are, 8 of us in front of our blank canvases, And we're all painting the same bridge, but you better believe at the end of 2 hours, we all had radically different bridges. So here we are looking at the same stuff, and we're just seeing it much different. Our brush strokes, the colors, and so on. I think you get the point. So what we want people to walk away with is that you're responsible for your second thought and your first action, meaning your initial response to seeing somebody different than you or engaging with somebody different than you is probably going to have some negative narratives in there, because there's a danger of a single narrative that tends to occur when you don't understand people. You tend to kind of boil them down to a few essential, often negative stereotypes, instead of making generalizations about people where you can be open-minded and ask questions and be curious versus asserting your assumptions, because assumptions become how you treat people, and how you treat people has an impact on them. And within an organization, that means that it's going to impact our organization negatively in one way or another. So again, I go back to you're responsible for your second thought and your first action. And then also we have a training around bridging cultural differences, because we know that people function very differently from space to space. Some people are very direct communicators. Some are very indirect communicators. Some people are very task oriented. Others are very relationship oriented. So we do some work around mapping at an individual level and at an organizational level. How is my team different from me? And how can we bridge those gaps? So we go through a series of exercises to help people think through, when I'm dealing with difference, this is a strategy and an approach that I can take. And it's simple to do. You can sit down with somebody and work through these continuum exercises that we have and quickly come up with a game plan around, hey, this is where we're most different. And this might actually get in the way of us having great communication and having great collaboration. So let's get after it now before it becomes a problem later. That's one, I think, core example of what kind of trainings that we have. But another thing I'd like to highlight is recently we started this inclusion series on campus where we're hosting candid conversations, and we're hosting a film series. On that candid conversation topic, we are talking about the issues that are a bit scary to bring into the workplace. If you think about the Philando Castile verdict that took place last July, there was a lot of contention around that. And, we wanted to facilitate something because people come to work and they're dealing with these stresses and these external pressures. And most work environments don't really allow you to talk about that stuff openly. And on top of that, if you're not part of the affected community, you have coworkers running around smiling, high-fiving each other, completely oblivious to what's going on in your head, which kind of exacerbates the stress that it causes you. And that creates a really negative environment. So we wanted to create a space where, we talk about English as a second language, what that looks like. We talk about supporting loved ones with mental health issues, with traumatic experiences that they're living through. We've talked about sexual harassment, facing the huge conversation that's happening publicly. And what does that look like? We share information, we share stories, and you instantly see a connection between people who never met each other before in that room around this topic. We also have that film series that I just brought up where we're taking culturally marginalized topics, people's experiences from different communities, and we're trying to bring them front and center, because you can debate the merits of ideology or political leanings or religious or what have you all day long, and you're not necessarily going to change somebody else's thoughts. But if you put a movie with a very compelling storyline and great information tucked in there, you can't really argue with that movie. You have to kind of absorb it, process it, and then we discuss it. So it's all about creating safe space, because everybody deserves to be safe, but nobody deserves to be comfortable. You know what I mean?
It's very interesting because everything you said, D&I has to be very deliberate in a company. It's not like something that you want to do because, it's cool, it's good for our brands. You have a lot of things that need to happen behind the curtains to make it work effectively.
Yeah. And if you do it wrong, it has the opposite impact that you intended. So, you take 2 steps forward, you can take 1 step back. Next week, we're hosting a discussion around, it's kind of a catchy title, but it's called Diversity and Exclusion, meaning, what is it like to feel excluded from the diversity conversation? And more importantly, how can we get you involved in the work? We've been doing desk drops this week, going and making that personal invitation and saying, hey, I want to see you there. I hope that you can make it. Can you come? Because there's a level of personal accountability and concern when somebody approaches you versus just sending you a calendar invite, you know?
So do you have a couple of examples, one or two examples of things that you've learned the hard way implementing D&I at Best Buy?
Yeah. There's a lot of things. We've learned that until you really get buy-in at the top, pushing the work as hard as you want to, it does not really matter. This is a space that you got to work smarter and harder, but more importantly, smarter. And for senior leaders to get it, you got to make the business case, as I mentioned earlier, really compelling. And it's kind of cliche to me at this point, but until they can internalize it and make it their own, it's not going to be that important. They need to see the big picture. They need to build some capacity to care, and they have to have the know-how to apply it in their own worlds. And it's really important that you get in front of them often. I think one challenge that gets in the way a lot is, again, those myths of D&I, where people don't see themselves in the work. And you got to dispel that myth as much as you can. I kind of think back to the time where we had our Black employee resource group held an ice cream social, and a majority of the white folks on campus just kept walking. And when I went and talked to a few of them that I knew, they said, well, I'm white, so I don't feel included or welcome at the Black ice cream social, even though it was in a public space and we were waving people in, you know? So until you get people to really get a stake in the game, you're just kind of either talking over their heads, or you're not reaching their heart, or you might just be ticking them off. Because I know that we get a variety of ethics complaints sometimes when we're trying to push the envelope, because people feel uncomfortable about this. Some people don't believe that this work belongs in the workplace. Mm-hmm. We wholeheartedly disagree.
That's pretty amazing.
The whole budget conversation, but that's another topic.
Yeah, no, that's pretty amazing, because I can imagine that it must be uncomfortable for some people to talk about diversity, whatever it might be, whether it's religious beliefs, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity. So how do you deal with this? Is it when you have complaints or when you have questions, does it become an HR thing? Does it still remain within the D&I team and environment? How does it work?
Yeah, so an important thing to note about D&I work is that we're really not in control of how other people in the organization move. What we're really in control of is influencing folks. So, we're not in charge of the recruiting goals, but we're working hard to influence how they do candidate slates and keeping them diverse. We're not, we have to play our role within the organization, and you have to be unapologetic about the work, because while we support differing beliefs and different systems of coming at this stuff, every opinion is not valid. Every opinion is not acceptable, right? If you're a Nazi or a white supremacist, frankly, you're not going to like anything that we have to say, because the work that we're doing is about equity and equality. And, if that really bothers you, then maybe you're at the wrong organization, because we got to make this culture work for everybody. And we know from plenty of personal anecdotes that it doesn't work for everybody. And we get it right sometimes, we get it wrong sometimes, but you got to be open to making mistakes.
If you were to give 2 or 3 pieces of advice for anyone who's considering implementing for the first time a D&I initiative in a company, what would they be?
A couple pieces of advice. I'd say one is benchmark with other businesses who might be considered best in class across a variety of those dimensions, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's already successes that exist out there.
Yes.
And it's interesting because D&I is one space within a company where we're extremely open to sharing best practices and feedback, right? I talk to a lot of our peers, whether they're across town, the big ones, or across the country, and they've shared, tremendous ideas with us that in one way or another could fit the model of what we're trying to accomplish, or kind of learn from the pitfalls and the poor investments that they've made. So I think benchmarking to stand on the foundation that, not only do you have a good idea, but it's been executed well in other spaces. So we can do it here as well, right? It's kind of a hope and belief thing, but also a results thing. And then you got to get right up to the senior leaders, and you got to get them to commit with actions and performance goals. And that's not going to happen on the front end. It really has to, that business case has to resonate, and it has to be a well thought out strategy, because leaders will poke holes in strategies. You know this. And they have to have a personal connection to this work too. So it has to be measured at some point. Jack Welch famously said, what gets measured gets done. So don't try to run and do this work and then involve senior leaders in the fourth quarter, right? Obviously, it has to be some grassroots initiatives to kind of get it going.
Right.
But find the right partners and collaborate in the first quarter. Don't wait until the 2-minute warning of the game. Because you can spend months on a proposal thinking it's going to be the right play, but if it doesn't integrate into the broader strategy, it's not going to be the priority. And then I mentioned these two things earlier around just the things people should be doing. You need trainings for your people leaders. They need to become conscious. They need to know how they're hurting people and how they can help people. You'll almost always find that within an organization, while we might be aligned around certain company goals, like the big goals, that our perceptions of our teammates and other departments that we partner with are usually lined with negativity. I've done probably 50 different trainings in the past year or so where we talk to leaders of teams and we talk to them about how their assumptions lead to treatment and then impact on individuals and in the business. And while we have a positive orientation around where the company's going, we tend to have a negative system of beliefs around the people that we work with. So we have to address that. You have to unpack that and figure out, what are the solves for that. And then again, lastly, you got to create a forum for difficult conversations. And that's an easy thing to do. All you got to do is create a space, have some facilitators who know what they're talking about, because you should be making it easy for people to go deep with each other, because that creates connection. Bring some focus to the approach. Figure out what's going on behind the curtain, because you'll be shocked at what people are struggling with, questions that they've been holding on to forever and never have had the confidence to speak on. And also, you'll see how quickly those heart connections are made, and it makes a huge difference in people's lives. I think those are all fairly easy to get to. They're not super cost intensive. There's a ton of resources out here on how to do this stuff. You just got to take the initiative.
How many people are on the D&I team at Best Buy?
We have a massive team of 5 people. I say massive because they're all incredible.
Well, I mean, it's pretty good ratio when you think about it. 5 people for 1,000 employees.
Yeah, more like 20,000. But again, most of the work that we do is achieved through the teams that we empower and bring information to. So while we might be a team of 5, we have hundreds of people involved with our employee resource groups. We have dozens of leaders engaged in the work both at corporate and in the field who take this work very seriously. We've been building committees and groups within our organization to advocate not only with the people, but within their business strategy teams to make sure that it's a line item on their objectives.
Are there companies that are a source of inspiration for you in terms of D&I?
Personally and professionally, I would look to organizations like Microsoft, Target, obviously, who's our friend down the street, does a fantastic job in a lot of ways. There's a lot of organizations who do this work at a really high level. Sodexo, constantly getting high ratings. Amazon does some great stuff, but they're pretty secretive about how they move. Walmart, interestingly, has made some really big strides in recent years along these lines as well. And I think they might have 20 times the amount of employees that we have here. So it's been interesting to watch them at scale. I think they have over 2 million employees within the Walmart chain. So there's a lot of people. Oh, yeah, General Mills. Got to shout out General Mills because they have invested in this work for decades now. They have, I think, notably over 30 mentorship programs at their organization. So there's a lot of shining lights out there. And what we're trying to do is just kind of make a mosaic of all these wins in other organizations and kind of looking at the DNA in our own history and holding up the things that we've done best and try to make them better.
So before we conclude today, let me ask you some fun and personal questions.
Yeah.
If you were to invite someone famous for a dinner, who would you choose?
Is this personal? We're talking personal, right?
Yeah.
Someone for a dinner. I'd love to have dinner with Barack Obama or Van Jones. Both really diplomatic, very logical, very very knowledgeable about these topics, not only from a business imperative standpoint, but also from a social justice standpoint. But also their personal stories and the triumphs and the struggles that they've had to overcome. They have books out there written about them, about how tremendous their lives have been. I think you got to have excellent mentors in your circle who can help you approach this work from a logical, rational place, because D&I work is very emotional for a lot of people. And we all know how arguments go when the more emotional person chimes in. They don't usually win that argument from a logical standpoint. So we try to kind of stay above the emotional piece. We infuse it, but you got to keep it logical.
So I know that you have some hobbies outside of work, but let me ask you this. When you were a kid, what was your dream job?
Well, my dream job, which I would say is still in part a pretty big factor in my life, is music production. Mm-hmm. I have been creating music for over 20 years now, and it's mostly been a hobby, passion of mine. It's kind of meditative. It's a singular focus for hours on end. It's kind of perfecting a craft. It kind of helps you build your identity and who you are. But as a career, and also as a parallel to diversity work, is that, my big passion is hip hop. And hip hop has become the global language of youth. And you can go to any major urban space anywhere in the world. You name a city, you're going to feel the elements of hip hop present. It's the global language of connection now, whether that's through hip hop dance. You can go on YouTube and look up international Red Bull breakdance battles where people speak different languages, come from different religions, but they're all kind of rallying around this craft. And it's just remarkable to see how you can transform a community through the power of music and empowering voices. So I think from a very early age that empowered me to want to get involved with organizations at a cultural level, because when you can transform a culture, you can transform people's lives.
So being from Minneapolis, are you a Prince fan?
Funny enough, I didn't grow up listening to Prince music because my family, more specifically my mother and her age group, they all knew Prince. They grew up together, attended high school together. And my aunt actually owns a home that Prince once lived in, and there's Prince graffiti in the basement of that home.
No kidding.
And so it's kind of a interesting look, and I've grown to appreciate his work more and more. But as a kid, I didn't grow up listening to that because he was he was the short kid from around the neighborhood. It's not even those kids. So I've just in recent years really began to appreciate his genius and the impact that he's made. And I'm proud that he's from this city. He's kind of a shining beacon of inclusion. And in fact, from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, he was a pioneer. He kind of brought this androgyny around gender fluidity, right? Where he kind of played both ends, and he was still sexy, and he was still appealing to women, and he was, he kind of transcended those gender binaries. And also, he had women of all races in his bands, and he really talked about things that people were scared to talk about. So he's really an idol in more ways than one.
Yeah, that's everything is very true. Big fan of Prince. If you were to pick an item that you always take with you when you travel or you go on vacation, what would that be?
For sure, it is my my music production laptop and a 25-key MIDI controller. Essentially, it's a 25-key a portable piano that can trigger all the sounds and programs within my software. So I create music from, on the airplane, from the beach when I'm in California or in Florida. And it really just is just such a tremendous way to stay connected and practiced and, happy. It keeps me really happy.
So what's your inspiration to write music?
I think just the world around me. I think that there's so much inspiration from my peers. And, there's a competitive streak amongst us all where we just want to kind of create the best music that we've ever made. And it's kind of like this Olympic style of seeking perfection where we obsess over the craft in so many ways. And you learn a lot about yourself in that process. And you learn a lot about others in that process, because I've worked with hundreds of different artists and hundreds of egos. And, you really just get to understand the world around you in a completely different light. And it's very empowering.
So we met a few months ago at Employee Experience Summit that I hosted in Minneapolis. And
great summit, by the way.
Thank you.
Awesome.
And obviously we talked about D&I. You were on the panel along with others. But I was really surprised by the quality of food that you find in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Very diverse, but very sophisticated as well, which I didn't believe before I ate in a few restaurants. So what is your favorite foods?
Ooh, that's a tough one. In true Gemini fashion, I'm hot and cold about a lot of things. So I might like something one month and kind of obsess over it. But to your point, we have a tremendous foodie scene and also a great craft beer scene.
Yes.
I'm a big fan of that. And as you know, because we met at Summit Brewery, who's one of the trademark ones of Minneapolis. But on any given weekend, let's say, you can find me at 2 or 3 a.m. after a studio session at a local taco spot owned by Mexican families, or eating pho at a Vietnamese restaurant on Nicollet Avenue on East Street. But I think the flux of restaurants and the changes, there's always a new offering. There's a cool Jamaican spot now on Nicollet Avenue as well. So really just try to mix it up, try to get exposed to new things. But if you ask me what I love to cook, I'm a spaghetti guy. Very simple.
Very different from Jamaican food.
Great leftovers.
All right. What is the way for listeners to follow you and Best Buy on social media?
If you want to reach out to me directly, john.hardy@bestbuy.com is my probably preferred method of connection. Otherwise, on LinkedIn, I'm John Hardy 612, I believe. Yeah, you can find me, John Hardy, Mr. 612. And if I catch you on Twitter or Facebook, it's probably because we're personal friends now. So you find me at one of those other more professional avenues, then I'll let you into my crazy world.
All right. And we'll share those, maybe not Facebook, but we'll share those on the podcast notes. So any last word of advice or wisdom before we conclude?
Just, stay true to who you are. Be bold, take action, be unapologetic when you know that your heart's in the right place and that the work needs to get done, and have fun while doing it, because, life is too short to stress out every day. And I'm personally focused on trying to make my own life a little bit better every day, even if it's just 1%, but also try to make the people around me better, and try to support places and people that I love and that I don't love, that I need to love, because there's always more work to do, and we can do it together.
Great way to conclude the interview today. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.